The Man Outside the Window, a true scary story. I grew up in a quiet town in northern Ohio. It was one of those places where nothing bad ever really seemed to happen. Everyone knew everyone, people left their doors unlocked, and kids would ride their bikes around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. Because of that, my parents were never overly paranoid about safety. As long as I was home before dark, they didn't worry too much. But one night when I was 15, completely changed the way my family looked at our neighborhood. It was a Friday night in early fall. My parents had gone to visit my aunt who lived about an hour away. They trusted me enough to stay home alone for the evening. I remember actually being excited about it. I ordered pizza, turned on the TV in the living room, and spent most of the night playing video games. Everything felt normal and peaceful. Our house sat on a corner lot with a decent-sized backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. Nothing huge, just a patch of trees that separated our neighborhood from the next street over. Around 11:30 p.m., I started getting tired. I shut everything down, locked the doors like my parents always reminded me to do, and went upstairs to my bedroom. My room faced the backyard. Normally, I liked that view because during the day you could see the trees and sometimes deer walking through them. At night, though, it was just darkness. Before getting into bed, I glanced out the window. And that's when I saw someone standing near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it might just be a shadow or maybe a tree branch moving in the wind. But after staring for a few seconds, I realized it was definitely a person. He was standing completely still. The distance between him and the house was probably about 30 feet, but even from that far away, something about the way he stood made my stomach drop. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't walking. He was staring directly at my window. I quickly stepped away from the glass. My first thought was that maybe it was just a neighbor cutting through the yard. That happened sometimes because of the way the properties connected near the woods. But then I looked again. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, perfectly still, staring straight at the house. I grabbed my phone and texted my dad. "Hey, there's someone in the backyard." He immediately called me. I whispered what was happening while keeping my eyes on the window. My dad told me to stay upstairs, lock my bedroom door, and call the police if the man came any closer. While we were on the phone, I peeked out the window again. The man was gone. At first, I felt relief. Then I realized something worse. If he wasn't by the trees anymore, that meant he was somewhere closer. My heart started pounding. I slowly backed away from the window and listened. The house was completely quiet. No footsteps. No doors opening. Nothing. Then I heard something downstairs. A faint sound. Like someone stepping on the wooden floor in the living room. I froze. There was absolutely no way someone should be inside the house. Every door had been locked. I whispered to my dad what I heard. His voice immediately changed from calm to serious. "Call 911 right now." I dialed as quietly as I could. While explaining the situation to the operator, I heard another noise. This time it was clearer. Footsteps. Slow ones. Walking across the living room. Then toward the stairs. The operator told me officers were already on the way. But the footsteps were getting closer. The stairs creaked. One step. Then another. Then another. Whoever it was wasn't rushing. He was taking his time. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I stared at my bedroom door, barely breathing. Then the doorknob slowly started turning. The door was locked. The knob rattled once. Then again. Then a third time harder. My voice shook as I shouted that the police were coming. Everything went silent. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. About 30 seconds later, I heard someone running down the stairs. Then the sound of the back door slamming shut. When the police arrived a few minutes later, they searched the entire house and yard. They never found the man. But they did find something that made my parents install security cameras the very next day. The officer called me downstairs and pointed to the back door. The lock wasn't broken. It had been unlocked the entire time, which meant the man outside the trees hadn't broken in. He had been inside the house the whole time, and he was just waiting for me to go upstairs. The man on the last bus. When I was 19, I worked a late shift at a grocery store just outside my town. My shift usually ended around 11:00 p.m., and since I didn't have a car at the time, I relied on the last city bus to get home. Most nights the bus had a few passengers, college students, workers finishing their shifts, or people heading home from downtown. But one night in early November was different. It had been raining all evening. The streets were wet and nearly empty when I walked to the bus stop. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the streetlights reflected off the pavement in a dull orange glow. When the bus finally arrived, the doors hissed open and I stepped inside. Immediately, I noticed how quiet it was. There were only two other people on the entire bus. One was the driver. The other was a man sitting halfway down the aisle. He wore a dark coat and a hood pulled low over his face. I didn't think much of it at first. People often kept to themselves on late-night buses. I walked toward the back and sat near the window. The bus started moving again. Rain tapped lightly against the glass as we passed through empty intersections and silent neighborhoods. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed something strange. The man hadn't moved. Not once. He was sitting perfectly still, facing forward. His posture looked stiff, almost unnatural. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through social media to pass the time. That's when I noticed something odd in the window reflection. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the reflection clearly showed someone standing in the aisle behind me. My stomach tightened. Slowly I turned around. There was no one there. The aisle behind me was empty. I frowned and looked back at the window. Now the reflection showed the same hooded man sitting in his original seat. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the lighting. But a minute later, I saw the reflection again. This time, the man was standing much closer behind me. I spun around quickly. Again, no one. Now my heart was racing. I looked toward the front of the bus. The man was still sitting in his seat. Except now, his head was turned slightly in my direction. Even though his hood covered most of his face, I could tell he was looking at me. That was enough for me. At the next stop, I stood up and walked toward the front. "Can you stop here?" I asked the driver. "This isn't a scheduled stop," he said. "Please," I insisted. He must have seen the panic on my face because he pulled over anyway. As soon as the doors opened, I stepped off the bus. The cold air hit me instantly. The bus began to pull away. But just before it disappeared down the street, I glanced up at the window. The hooded man was standing now, right behind the glass, and he was smiling directly at me. The voice in the baby monitor. 2 years ago, my sister asked me to stay at her house for a few nights after she had her first baby. She and her husband were exhausted from adjusting to life with a newborn, so I offered to help watch the baby at night. Their house was quiet and comfortable, located in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. On the second night, my sister and her husband went to bed early while I stayed downstairs watching TV. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table beside me. Around 2:00 3:00 a.m., the monitor suddenly made a soft crackling sound. At first, I thought the baby had woken up. But instead of crying, I heard something else. A voice. Very faint. It sounded like someone whispering. I leaned closer to the monitor. The voice was deep. Male. And it definitely wasn't my brother-in-law. The voice whispered slowly. Go back to sleep. A chill ran down my spine. I immediately ran upstairs toward the baby's room. The hallway was dark and silent. When I opened the nursery door, the baby was still asleep in the crib. The room was empty. No one else was inside. I searched the hallway, checked the bathroom, and even looked in the closets. Nothing. I went back downstairs and unplugged the monitor. The next morning, we checked the camera recording connected to the baby monitor. At exactly 1:58 a.m., something strange happened. The nursery door slowly opened, but no one walked in. The door simply opened and then slowly closed again. The baby never woke up. But right before the door shut, the audio captured the same whisper again. Go back to sleep. 3. The locked office floor. When I was in my early 20s, I worked night security at a small office building. The building had 4 floors, but only 2 of them were actively used. The third floor had been closed for renovations for almost a year. No employees worked up there anymore. One night around 1:30 a.m., I was sitting in the security room watching camera feeds. Everything was normal. Then I heard a noise. A chair scraping across the floor. It came from upstairs. I checked the camera monitor. Every hallway looked empty. But the sound happened again. This time it was louder. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and went upstairs to investigate. The second floor was empty. Completely silent. But the sound was clearly coming from above me. The third floor. That floor was supposed to be locked. I checked the stairwell door. It was closed but slightly ajar. My heart started pounding. I pushed the door open and stepped onto the third floor. The hallway lights flickered on automatically. The corridor was empty. Every office door was closed. I slowly walked down the hall, checking each room. Nothing. Just dusty desks and empty chairs. Then suddenly, one of the doors at the end of the hallway creaked open. I froze. That room didn't even have power connected anymore. I aimed my flashlight toward the doorway. The room looked completely dark. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow inside the room, standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I turned around and walked straight back to the stairwell. I finished my shift in the security room and never went back to the third floor again. 4. The house that was already sold. A few years ago, I was looking to buy my first house. One night while browsing online listings, I found a beautiful house at an unbelievably cheap price. It looked perfect. 2 stories, a large yard, and a quiet location. The listing had only one photo and a phone number. I decided to drive out and take a look. The house was located on a quiet road surrounded by tall trees. When I arrived, the place looked even better in person. I knocked on the front door. An older man opened it. He looked confused. Yes, he asked. I told him I was there about the house listing. He stared at me for a moment before saying something strange. This house was sold a year ago. I showed him the listing on my phone. He sighed. You're not the first person to come here about that. Apparently, several people had shown up over the past few months, saying they saw the same advertisement. But the house had already been purchased. When I asked who posted the listing, he shook his head. "We think it's the previous owner." "What do you mean?" I asked. The old man looked uncomfortable. "The previous owner disappeared in this house," he said quietly. "No one ever found him." Then he looked at the empty hallway behind him and added, "And sometimes strange things happen here at night." 5. The pool at 2 a.m. When my parents went away for a weekend trip, I decided to invite some friends over for a small pool party. Our backyard had a large in-ground pool surrounded by trees, making it feel very private. The party went well. About 20 friends came over. Music played, people swam, and everyone had a great time. Around 1:00 a.m., everyone finally left. I locked the back door, turned off the outdoor lights, and went upstairs to bed. About an hour later, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A splash. A big one. Like someone diving into the pool. I sat up in bed. A few seconds later, I heard swimming. Actual strokes through the water. I walked to my window and looked down into the backyard. The pool lights were still on, and there was a man swimming calmly from one end of the pool to the other. I had never seen him before. "Hey," I shouted from the window. The man stopped swimming and slowly looked up at me. Even from that distance, I could see he wasn't surprised. He simply stared. Then he climbed out of the pool. Water dripped from his clothes as he walked toward the back door of the house. The door I had locked earlier. I watched in shock as he slid it open and stepped inside. I ran to my bedroom door and locked it immediately. A few seconds later, I heard wet footsteps on the stairs. Slow, heavy, coming straight toward my room. He stopped right outside my door. Then he knocked. 3 slow knocks. In a calm voice he said, "It's me, open the door." I called the police. Minutes later, the footsteps ran back downstairs and the front door slammed shut. When the police arrived, the only evidence he had been there was a trail of water leading from the pool all the way to my bedroom door. 1. The footsteps in the apartment above. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment building in a quiet part of town. It was an older building, probably built sometime in the 1970s. Nothing fancy, just 3 floors and maybe 12 apartments total. My apartment was on the 2nd floor. The first night I moved in, everything felt normal. I unpacked a few boxes, ordered some takeout, and went to bed around midnight. At about 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the apartment directly above me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People walk around at night all the time. Maybe my upstairs neighbor was getting a glass of water or using the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going back and forth across the ceiling. Slow, steady packing. Back and forth. Back and forth. I checked my phone. 3:00 a.m. The packing continued. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, while grabbing my mail, I saw the building manager in the hallway. I casually mentioned the noise from the upstairs neighbor. He looked confused. "There's no one living above you," he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he shook his head. "That apartment has been empty for months." That night I paid closer attention. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the footsteps started again. This time they were louder. And at one point, they stopped directly above my bed. Then I heard something drag slowly across the floor, like furniture being moved. The next morning, I went upstairs to check. The door to the apartment was locked, but through the small gap under the door, I could see dust covering the floor. Except for one thing. Clear footprints, walking back and forth across the empty apartment. 2. The late-night caller. When I was in college, I worked the night shift at a small convenience store near campus. Most nights were quiet. A few customers would come in for snacks or drinks, but after midnight the place was usually empty. One night around 1:45 a.m., the phone behind the counter rang. I picked it up. "Hello, thank you for calling." Before I could finish, a man's voice interrupted. "I can see you." I frowned. "Excuse me. I can see you standing behind the counter." My heart skipped. I slowly looked around the store. No one was inside. "Who is this?" I asked. There was a pause. Then the man spoke again. "You should really lock the back door." A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned around and looked toward the storage hallway. The back door. It was slightly open. I immediately hung up and locked it. My phone rang again. I hesitated, then answered. The same voice whispered, "Too late." Right at that moment, I heard something move in the storage room behind me. 3. The cabin in the woods. A group of my friends and I rented a cabin in the mountains for a weekend trip. The cabin was remote, about 20 minutes from the nearest town and surrounded by thick forest. The first night was great. We made a fire, played games, and stayed up late talking. Around 2 a.m., everyone eventually went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later, needing to use the bathroom. On my way back to the bedroom, I noticed something strange through the window. There was someone standing outside. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends messing around. But then I realized something. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing the cabin, just watching. I went closer to the window. That's when the figure slowly raised its hand and waved. I woke up my friend and told him to look. But when he came to the window, the figure was gone. The next morning we checked outside. About 20 feet from the cabin, we found footprints in the dirt. They circled the cabin completely, like someone had been walking around it for hours. 4. The man in the elevator. I once worked late nights in a tall office building downtown. Most employees left by 7 p.m., but I often stayed until midnight. One night I finished my work around 11:45 p.m. and headed for the elevator. The building had 15 floors, but at that hour it was usually empty. The elevator arrived and the doors opened. Inside stood a man. He was facing the corner of the elevator. Not the door, just the corner. I hesitated but stepped inside. The doors closed. Neither of us spoke. Then I noticed something strange. He hadn't pressed any floor button. Neither had I yet. But the elevator started moving. Down. Floor 12. Floor 11. Floor 10. The man slowly turned his head toward me and quietly said, "This elevator doesn't stop at the bottom anymore." Right then the elevator lights flickered, and the floor display went blank. 5. The knock at the window. When I was 16, my bedroom was on the second floor of our house. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. A knock. On my window. I froze. My room was on the second floor. There was no balcony outside, and the window faced the backyard. The knocking came again. 3 slow taps. I slowly sat up and looked toward the window. At first, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then lightning flashed outside. For just a split second, I saw a face pressed against the glass. A man. Smiling. I screamed, and my parents ran into the room. When we looked outside, no one was there. The police searched the yard but found nothing. But the next morning, we discovered something disturbing. Directly below my window were deep marks in the dirt, like someone had been standing there, using a ladder, and watching my window. 1. The man on the security camera. A few years ago, I worked as a night guard at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The job was easy most nights. I would sit in the security room and watch camera feeds from around the building. One night around 3:10 a.m., one of the cameras flickered. It was the camera watching the loading dock outside. At first everything looked normal. The empty parking lot, the large metal doors, the yellow lights glowing above the dock. Then suddenly, a man walked into frame. He wasn't wearing any uniform or safety vest like the workers normally did. He just stood there, completely still, staring directly at the camera. I checked the time again. 3:11 a.m. No deliveries were scheduled at that hour. I zoomed in. The man slowly raised his hand and pointed at the camera. Then he mouthed something. I couldn't hear him, but it looked like he said, "I see you." My stomach dropped, because the camera he was looking at was inside the building, facing outward, which meant he somehow knew exactly where the security room was. I checked the other cameras, the hallway outside the security room, and that's when I saw him again, walking down the hallway toward me. 2. The voice from the closet. When I was a kid, I had a habit of leaving my closet door slightly open at night. One night I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. At first I thought I heard my parents talking downstairs, but then I realized the sound was coming from inside my room. From the closet. It sounded like whispering, very quiet, like someone talking under their breath. I stayed completely still in bed, trying to listen. The whispering stopped. For a moment everything was silent. Then I heard a voice, very close, from inside the closet. It said, "Are you awake?" I covered my head with the blanket and didn't move until morning. When I finally checked the closet the next day, the door was wide open. 3. The empty train platform. One winter night, I was waiting for the last train home. The station was nearly empty. Just me and one other man standing near the far end of the platform. He was wearing a long coat and staring down the tracks. The digital board said the train would arrive in 3 minutes. But something about the man made me uneasy. He hadn't moved since I arrived. Not even slightly. When the train finally came, the doors opened and I stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, I looked back. The man was gone. But the strange part wasn't that he left. It was that the snow around where he had been standing was completely untouched. No footprints. 4. The hotel room above me. I once stayed in a cheap hotel during a road trip. The room above mine was empty according to the front desk. But around midnight, I started hearing sounds. Footsteps. Then something heavy dropping on the floor. Then footsteps again. At first I ignored it, but the sounds kept happening every few minutes. Eventually, I called the front desk. They insisted no one was staying in that room. Curious, I went upstairs to check. The hallway light flickered as I walked down it. When I reached the door to that room, it slowly creaked open, and the room inside was completely dark. 5. The figure on the road. I was driving home late one night on a quiet country road. There were no streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. About halfway home, I saw someone standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down. The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized it was a man wearing old clothes. He was facing away from me. I honked the horn. Nothing. Then he slowly turned around. and his face looked completely blank. No expression, no emotion, just staring. I quickly drove around him, but in my rearview mirror, he was suddenly much closer to my car. Running. 6. The neighbor who never came outside. When I moved into my apartment, I noticed the man in the building next door always stood by his window. Every night, just staring outside. At first I thought nothing of it, but weeks passed, and he never left that window, never came outside, never moved to another room. One night I looked up again and realized something horrifying. The man hadn't moved at all, not even slightly, like he wasn't breathing. 7. The text message. One night I received a text message from an unknown number. It said, "Don't turn around." I laughed at first, probably a prank. Then another message came. "I'm behind you." I was sitting alone in my living room. My heart started racing. Another message appeared. "I can see the TV light." Slowly I turned around. The room behind me was empty. Then my phone buzzed again. Wrong house. 8. The person in the backyard. When I was 14, my bedroom window overlooked the backyard. One night I woke up and noticed someone standing near the fence. Just standing there, watching the house. I assumed it was a neighbor. But after 10 minutes, they hadn't moved. Not even a little. I blinked and looked again. The figure was now closer to the house, but I hadn't seen them move. 9. The door that opened. I was home alone one night watching TV. Suddenly, I heard the front door slowly open. I stood up immediately. No one else should have been home. I walked into the hallway. The door was wide open, cold air blowing inside. I stepped outside to check. No one was there. When I turned back toward the house, the door slowly closed by itself. 10. The man on the playground. One night around midnight, I walked past a playground near my apartment. The park was empty, except for one man sitting on the swing. He was gently swinging back and forth, looking at the ground. As I walked past, he suddenly spoke. Without looking up, "You shouldn't be here this late." I kept walking, but curiosity made me glance back. The swing was still moving, but the man was gone. 1. The man who knocked at 3:17 a.m. About 4 years ago, I lived alone in a small rental house just outside a quiet town in Illinois. The neighborhood was peaceful, mostly families and older couples who had lived there for years. Nothing strange ever really happened there, which is probably why what happened that night still bothers me so much. It was a Tuesday night in the middle of October. The weather had already started getting cold, and the wind outside made the trees scratch against the windows every now and then. I had gone to bed around midnight. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The room was dark and silent. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time. 3:17 a.m. Right as I set the phone back down, I heard it. Knocking. 3 slow knocks. They came from the front door downstairs. I froze. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming, but then it happened again. Knock. 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 My heart started beating faster. Nobody should be visiting my house at that hour. I slowly got out of bed and walked to my bedroom window, which overlooked the front yard. I carefully pulled the curtain back just a little. There was a man standing on my porch. He was tall and wearing a dark jacket. His face was hard to see in the dim porch light. He just stood there, staring at the door. Then he knocked again. 3 slow knocks. Something about the way he stood there made me uneasy. He wasn't shifting his weight or looking around like someone normally would. He was completely still. After a minute, he turned his head slightly and looked directly at my window. I quickly stepped back from the curtain. There was no way he should have been able to see me. I waited silently for a few seconds. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps. Not walking away from the porch. Walking around the side of the house. Toward the backyard. To the locked classroom. When I was in high school, I used to stay late after school for basketball practice. Most of the time, I'd leave around 7 p.m., when the building was already nearly empty. One evening, I finished practice later than usual. By the time I walked back into the school hallways, it was almost 8 p.m. The building felt strangely quiet. The janitor was somewhere on the first floor, and I was alone on the second-floor locker room area. As I walked down the hallway toward the exit, I heard a noise. A chair scraping across the floor. It came from one of the classrooms nearby. I stopped. That room should have been empty. All the doors were supposed to be locked after school hours. Curious, I walked toward the classroom door. The lights inside were off, but I could clearly hear movement. Another scraping sound, like someone slowly dragging a chair across the floor. I knocked on the door. "Hello?" The noise stopped immediately. Total silence. I waited for a few seconds, then tried the door handle. It was locked. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a shadow moving under the door. Someone was definitely inside. But no one had been inside that classroom all day. 3. The car that followed me. A few years ago, I used to work late shifts at a warehouse. My shift ended around midnight, and the drive home took about 30 minutes through mostly empty roads. One night, I noticed a car behind me as I left the parking lot. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But after about 10 minutes of driving, I realized something strange. The car was still behind me. Every turn I made, it made two. Even when I took a random side road I normally never used. The car followed. Now I was starting to get nervous. I sped up a little. The car kept the same distance. Its headlights stayed directly in my mirror. After another 5 minutes, I decided to test something. Instead of heading home, I drove toward the local police station. As soon as the building came into view, something strange happened. The car suddenly slowed down. Then it turned off its headlights and disappeared into a side street. I never saw it again. But the next morning, I noticed something disturbing. There were muddy footprints on the ground near my apartment door. 4. The window in the woods. When I was 18, my friends and I decided to explore a forest trail behind our town. The trail wasn't officially maintained anymore, but people still used it sometimes for hiking. About 20 minutes into the woods, we found something strange. A window. Just a normal house window frame standing upright in the middle of the forest. There were no walls. No building. Just the window frame attached to a piece of wood stuck in the ground. We laughed about it at first, thinking someone must have left it there as a joke. But then one of my friends noticed something. There were footprints around it. Fresh ones. Like someone had been standing there recently. We joked about looking through the window like it was a picture frame. But when I looked through, it toward the trees on the other side. I saw something move. A person standing behind a tree. Watching us. The moment I pointed it out to my friends, the figure stepped back into the woods and disappeared. We left the trail immediately. The weirdest part. When we returned a week later, the window was gone. 5. The man in the empty office. About 2 years ago, I worked late nights cleaning an office building. The building had 5 floors, but only 3 were still used by employees. The top floor had been empty for almost a year. One night around 1 a.m., I was vacuuming the third-floor hallway when I heard footsteps above me. At first I thought maybe security was doing a check. But the footsteps sounded slow, heavy, walking back and forth across the floor. I called the security desk downstairs. They told me no one else was in the building. I decided to go upstairs and check anyway. The fourth floor was empty. Then I reached the fifth floor. The hallway lights flickered on. Everything looked abandoned. Dust everywhere. Empty cubicles. But then I saw something that made me stop. At the far end of the hallway, a man was standing by the window, completely still, facing outside. I called out to him, "Hello." The man slowly turned his head toward me and smiled. Then the hallway lights suddenly went out. When they turned back on a few seconds later, he was gone. The man who lived in my attic. True scary story narration. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in the state of Ohio. It was the kind of place where nothing strange ever seemed to happen. Families had lived in the same houses for years. Kids rode their bikes down the streets until sunset, and most people never even bothered locking their doors. Our house was older than most of the others in the area. My parents bought it when I was about 8 years old. It was a 2-story house with a basement and a large attic that stretched across the entire top of the building. For years, the attic was just a place where we stored old boxes, holiday decorations, and random furniture that nobody wanted to throw away. At least that's what we thought. When I was 16, my bedroom was on the second floor, directly below the attic. Most nights were completely quiet, but every once in a while, usually late at night, I would hear a faint noise coming from above the ceiling. At first it sounded like scratching. Sometimes it sounded like slow footsteps. My parents always brushed it off. They said it was probably squirrels or raccoons moving around in the attic. And honestly, that explanation made sense. Old houses get animals in the attic all the time. But one night something happened that made me realize those noises weren't animals. It was a Friday night in the middle of winter. My parents had gone out to dinner with some friends, and my younger sister was staying over at a friend's house. So for the first time in a long while, I had the house completely to myself. I spent most of the evening playing video games in the living room. Around midnight, I finally turned everything off and headed upstairs to go to bed. The house was silent. I brushed my teeth, turned off the bathroom light, and walked into my room. Just as I was about to climb into bed, I heard something, a slow creak, directly above my ceiling. I froze. Then another sound, a very slow, careful step. It sounded exactly like someone walking across the attic floor. My heart started beating faster. I stood there listening for a few seconds. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving from one side of the attic to the other. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Even though the light couldn't reach the attic, it somehow made me feel a little safer. I stepped out into the hallway and looked up at the small square attic hatch in the ceiling. It was closed just like always. The footsteps continued. Whoever or whatever was up there was definitely moving around. At that point I told myself it had to be an animal. Still, something about the sound felt wrong. Animals don't usually walk slowly across floors like that. They run, they scratch, they scurry. This sounded like someone walking. I decided to ignore it and go to sleep. But about 20 minutes later, just as I was starting to drift off, the footsteps stopped. And then I heard something else. A soft thud, right above my room, followed by what sounded like whispering. My eyes snapped open. I sat up in bed and held my breath. There it was again. A faint voice. Two voices, actually. Talking quietly. Inside the attic. My entire body went cold. There was absolutely no way animals were making that sound. Someone was up there. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He answered after a few rings. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked. I told him what I was hearing. At first he thought I was joking. But when I insisted that I could hear people talking in the attic, his tone changed immediately. "Go outside," he said. "Right now." I didn't argue. I grabbed my jacket and ran downstairs, straight out the front door. I stood on the porch waiting for my parents to arrive. About 10 minutes later, their car pulled into the driveway. My dad immediately grabbed a flashlight and went inside the house. I followed him while my mom waited near the front door. We listened carefully. At first, there was nothing. Complete silence. My dad slowly pulled down the attic ladder. Dust fell from the ceiling as it unfolded. He shined the flashlight up into the darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then we heard it. Movement. Fast movement. Something shifting deeper inside the attic. My dad climbed up the ladder. The attic was large but mostly empty, except for stacks of boxes and old furniture. He walked further inside. Then suddenly he stopped. "What the hell?" he said quietly. I climbed halfway up the ladder to see what he was looking at. Near the far corner of the attic, someone had made a small living area. There were blankets on the floor, empty food wrappers, water bottles, even a flashlight in a backpack. Someone had been living in our attic for who knows how long. But the creepiest part wasn't the makeshift bed. It was the vent. Right above it. The vent connected directly to my bedroom ceiling, which meant whoever had been staying up there could hear everything happening in my room. Every conversation, every phone call, every night I slept. And the scariest part, when my dad searched the rest of the attic, the person was gone. Somewhere in the back corner was a small opening that led to the roof access. Whoever had been living there must have escaped through it. The police came later that night and searched the neighborhood. They never found anyone. But they did confirm something that still makes my stomach turn whenever I think about it. Based on the amount of food wrappers and supplies up there, that person had probably been living in our attic for weeks, maybe even months, listening to us, watching us, waiting for the house to be empty. The man living under my house. When I was 17, my family moved into a house that was much older than anything we had lived in before. It was built sometime in the early 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and a crawl space instead of a full basement. At first, everything about the house felt normal. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. My mom would sometimes notice food missing from the kitchen. Small things at first, like bread, fruit, or leftovers from the fridge. She assumed one of us kids was sneaking food late at night. But we all denied it. Then one night around 2 a.m., I woke up because I heard a strange noise. It sounded like someone slowly crawling under the floor. Our house had wooden floors, and underneath was a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the entire house. At first, I thought it might be an animal. But the movement sounded too slow, too deliberate. The next night it happened again. And the night after that. Every time, around the same hour. Eventually, my dad decided to check the crawlspace entrance outside the house. When he opened it, he immediately froze. Inside the crawlspace, someone had placed blankets, empty food containers, and a flashlight. Someone had been living underneath our house. But the truly terrifying part was when my dad shined his flashlight deeper into the darkness. Because at the far end of the crawl space, something moved, and then we heard crawling sounds rushing toward the opposite exit. Whoever had been living there escaped into the night. The police searched the area but never found anyone. But for months afterward, I couldn't sleep. Because every once in a while, late at night, I still heard movement under the floor. To the night security job. In my early 20s, I took a job working night security at a large office complex. The building had 6 floors, but only the first 4 were still in use. The top 2 floors had been abandoned after a company moved out. Most nights my job was simple. Walk through the building every hour and make sure everything was locked. One night around 3 a.m., I was watching the security cameras when something strange appeared. A man walking down the hallway on the 6th floor. That floor was supposed to be empty. I checked the entry logs. No one had entered the building for hours. Thinking it might be a glitch in the camera feed, I went upstairs to check. The 6th floor hallway was dark and silent. Every office door was closed. Then I heard something. A slow tapping sound. Coming from the last office at the end of the hallway. I pushed the door open. Inside was an empty office. Dust everywhere. No furniture. No people. But on the far wall, someone had written a message in the dust. I know you're watching. At that exact moment, I heard footsteps behind me in the hallway. 3. The road that wasn't on the map. A few years ago, I was driving across state late at night. My GPS suddenly suggested a shortcut that would supposedly save 20 minutes. It directed me off the highway and onto a narrow country road. At first, everything seemed normal. But after about 10 minutes of driving, I realized something strange. The road wasn't appearing on the map anymore. Just a blank gray area. The road grew darker and narrower. Then suddenly, I saw a small gas station ahead. The building looked extremely old, like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I pulled in to ask for directions. Inside was a single old man behind the counter. When I told him where I was trying to go, he stared at me strangely. Then he asked, "How did you find this road?" I told him my GPS directed me here. He shook his head slowly. That road hasn't been used in 30 years. 4. The camera that watched me. When I moved into my first apartment, I installed a cheap security camera inside the living room. Mostly just for peace of mind when I was away. One night I woke up around 2:30 a.m. and checked my phone. I had received several motion alerts from the camera. But when I opened the app, the room looked empty. Still, the motion detection kept triggering. The next morning, I checked the recorded footage. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something. Around 2:14 a.m., a shadow moved across the wall. But nothing was there to cast it. Then something even stranger happened. The camera slowly tilted downward, like someone had grabbed it. Even though I lived alone. 5. The man in the mirror. When I was 19, I worked late shifts at a restaurant. One night I got home around 1:30 a.m. and went straight to the bathroom to wash my face. The bathroom mirror faced the hallway behind me. As I looked at my reflection, something caught my eye. A shadow moving in the hallway. I turned around immediately. The hallway was empty. I looked back at the mirror. And for a split second, I swear I saw someone standing behind me. A tall man. Completely still. But when I turned around again, there was no one there. After that night, I started noticing other things. Doors slightly open that I had closed. Objects moved in the kitchen. Footsteps in the hallway late at night. Eventually, I installed cameras. But the strange thing is, the cameras never captured anyone. Only me. Walking around the apartment. Sometimes in the middle of the night. While I was asleep. The room that was never rented. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment building while attending college. It was an old 3-story building with narrow hallways and creaky wooden stairs. Most of the tenants were either students or older people who had lived there for years. My apartment was on the second floor. Across the hallway from my unit was another apartment, apartment 204. From the first day I moved in, something about that apartment felt strange. I never saw anyone go in or out of it. But every night around the same time, I heard movement inside. Footsteps. Sometimes furniture shifting. Occasionally a door closing. At first I assumed someone lived there but kept to themselves. After a few weeks, curiosity got the best of me. One evening while checking my mail downstairs, I asked the building manager about the neighbor in 204. He looked confused. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. That apartment hasn't been rented in almost 2 years. I laughed thinking he was joking. But he showed me the records. The last tenant moved out after complaining about strange noises. That night I paid closer attention. Around 2:15 am. The footsteps started again. Slow packing across the floor. Back and forth. But the creepiest part was when the footsteps suddenly stopped. Right outside my door. And I heard a faint scratching sound on the other side. Like someone slowly dragging their fingernails across the door. The night shift at the storage facility. When I was 22, I worked night security at a self-storage facility on the edge of town. The job was mostly boring. I sat in a small office watching security cameras and occasionally drove around the property to make sure everything was locked. One night around 3 a.m., the motion alarm on one of the storage units went off. Unit B17. The cameras showed the hallway outside the unit. But no one was there. Thinking it might be an animal, I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. The facility was completely silent. When I reached B17, the door was slightly open. I knew for a fact that unit had been empty for months. I slowly pulled the door open. Inside the unit was completely dark. But I could hear breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. From somewhere inside the storage unit. The house at the end of the street. When I was growing up, there was one house in our neighborhood that everyone avoided. It sat at the very end of the street, surrounded by tall trees and an old rusted fence. Nobody seemed to live there. But every night lights appeared inside. My friends and I used to joke about it being haunted. One night when we were about 16, we decided to finally check it out. We walked down the street around midnight and climbed over the fence. The house looked abandoned. Broken windows. Peeling paint. We walked up to the front porch and pushed the door open. Inside the house was dark and dusty. But as we walked through the hallway, we noticed something strange. The floor was covered in footprints. Fresh ones. Leading deeper into the house. Then we heard a voice upstairs. Someone whispering. The man who knew my name. A few years ago, I used to take late-night walks around my neighborhood. It was usually quiet and peaceful. One night around midnight, I was walking past a small park when I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. As I walked past, he suddenly spoke. "Good evening, Daniel." I froze. I had never seen this man before. "How do you know my name?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stood up and began walking away. Before disappearing into the darkness, he turned back and said something that still chills me. "Because I've been watching you." 5. The camera in the hole. When I moved into my new apartment, the landlord had recently installed security cameras in the hallways. At first, it made me feel safer. But after a few weeks, something strange started happening. Every morning when I checked my phone, I had dozens of motion alerts from the hallway camera outside my door. But whenever I watched the footage, the hallway looked empty. No people. No movement. Just an empty corridor. One night, I stayed awake to see what was triggering the alerts. At exactly 3:03 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed. And this time, someone was standing in the hallway, right outside my door, perfectly still, staring directly into the camera. 1. The man who slept in my garage. About 6 years ago, my parents and I moved into a new house in a quiet suburb. It wasn't a huge place, but it had something we'd never had before: a detached garage behind the house. At first, the garage was just used for storage. Old furniture, boxes, tools, and things we didn't have room for inside the house. But after about a month of living there, strange things started happening. My dad noticed the garage door was sometimes slightly open in the morning. At first, he assumed one of us forgot to close it. Then my mom noticed something else. A few tools were missing from the workbench. We searched the whole garage but couldn't find them. My dad thought maybe they were misplaced. But one night around 2 a.m., I woke up to strange noise outside. It sounded like metal clanking. I looked out my bedroom window and saw the garage light on. That was strange because nobody should have been out there. I went downstairs and told my dad. He grabbed a flashlight and quietly walked outside. I followed a few steps behind him. When he opened the garage door, we both froze. In the far corner of the garage, someone had set up a sleeping area. Blankets, a pillow, empty food wrappers. Someone had been living in our garage. And judging by the amount of trash, they had probably been there for weeks. But the most disturbing part: the blankets were still warm. Whoever it was had just left. And we had no idea where they went. 2. The last elevator ride. When I worked in a downtown office building, I often stayed late to finish projects. The building had 20 floors, but after 9 p.m. almost everyone had gone home. One night I finished working around 11:30 p.m. I packed my bag and walked to the elevator. The hallway lights were dim, and the building felt unusually quiet. I pressed the elevator button. A few seconds later, the doors opened. Inside the elevator was a man standing in the corner. He was facing the wall. Not the door. Just the wall. I hesitated for a moment but stepped inside. The doors closed. Neither of us said anything. Then I noticed something strange. None of the floor buttons were pressed, but the elevator started moving. Down. Floor 14. Floor 13. Floor 12. I looked at the man. He slowly turned his head toward me. And in a calm voice he said, "You shouldn't be here this late." Then the elevator lights flickered, and the floor display suddenly went blank. 3. The old camera footage. When my uncle passed away, my family inherited his old house. Before selling it, we went through the house to sort out his belongings. While cleaning the basement, I found an old box full of security cameras and recording equipment. Apparently, my uncle had installed cameras around the house years ago. Most of the tapes were labeled with dates. Out of curiosity, I decided to watch one of them. The footage showed the front hallway of the house. At first it looked completely normal. The camera showed hours of empty hallway. But around 3:12 a.m. something happened. The front door slowly opened. No one was there. The door simply opened on its own. Then a shadow moved across the wall. But there was nothing in the hallway casting it. Then something even stranger happened. The camera suddenly tilted upward, like someone had grabbed it. And right before the tape ended, a man's face appeared extremely close to the lens. For the door in the basement. When I was younger, my friend's house had a basement that always felt unsettling. The basement was large and mostly unfinished, with concrete floors and dim lighting. But the strangest thing about it was a single door at the far end of the basement. The door was always locked. Whenever we asked his parents what was behind it, they simply said it was storage. One night when we were about 15, we were hanging out in the basement playing video games. Around midnight, we heard a noise. A knocking sound, coming from the other side of the locked door. At first, we thought someone upstairs dropped something. But then it happened again. 3 slow knocks. We both stared at the door. Then we heard something else. A voice, very quiet, whispering from behind the door. My friend immediately ran upstairs to tell his parents. When they came down to check, the basement was silent. His dad unlocked the door and opened it. Inside was a small, empty storage room. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. The room had no windows and no other door, which meant there was absolutely nowhere for anyone to hide.